become a bestseller. It's an excellent book. And he's written his second book, Lost Connections, which is a lot to do with depression and the depression industry, which is probably the most popular medicine being prescribed nowadays, depression and anxiety. So you can, either one of them are $20 up the back or two for $30, Kathleen said today. So if you can afford it, I really recommend. Chasing the Scream's a great book. And this, you can put your email address on this, and we will send you an email once a week called the Hemp Embassy Headlines, which is really just any big news, particularly on cannabis, that's happened around the world in the last week. It's a free thing, it's worth doing too. So all that stuff's up at the back there, just keeping you in touch.
You forgot to send me off. See you later, people.
That's Dr. Deb. She'll be back. Sorry, Deb.
That's all right. Over to you, Carol.
And welcome to Carol from Epilepsy Action Australia.
Yep. If it doesn't have action in the title, it's not us.
And I was wrong yesterday saying she immediately embraced cannabis, but we talked her into it. Anyway, she's been a great advocate, and right at the front, she's doing the hard bit, hanging in on government committees. I couldn't handle it. Thanks, Carol.
Thank you, Michael. And again, how many people were here yesterday? Yeah, a few of you. Okay, so apologies for the same presentation, but as Michael said, I will try and say a few things differently and maybe open it up to a few more questions today as well, because I don't think I had time to actually field questions yesterday. So again, I will just repeat a couple of things. Epilepsy. Everybody's heard of epilepsy. It's probably the oldest known medical condition, in fact, pre-biblical times. And it's a little bit like cannabis, isn't it? It's been around forever. Two stigmatised conditions. There's probably no condition more neglected than epilepsy, according to the World Health Organization. And, as I say, the irony that two very stigmatised conditions have come together, and nothing's actually raised the awareness of epilepsy in the community that I've seen in my 14 years working with epilepsy, like cannabis has. So we started off some years ago very sceptical about cannabis, and I was explaining yesterday that I have nurses work for me, very conservative bunch of people, and I'm a pretty conservative person in some ways, and so we were very sceptical when we first heard that cannabis might be a treatment option for epilepsy. But there are some fairly amazing people that I've met over the years, the last 5 years or so, who have educated me and my staff. So just quickly a little bit about Epilepsy Action Australia. We work Australia-wide. If you just move forward, please, sister. We work Australia-wide, but just to put this in context, 65 million people in the world are diagnosed with epilepsy. It's not an uncommon condition, is it? Not an uncommon condition at all. And in Australia, that's around 250,000 Australians, or about 1% of the population. Next slide, please. Now, around about 30 to 35% of those people will not be helped by the currently available medications. So, for the other 65, 70%, they will get medication or potentially a couple of different anti-epileptic medications. They won't be cured, but their seizures will be reasonably well controlled. And this might mean somebody that's having seizures every week, perhaps being seizure-free for a number of years, or only having one or two seizures in a year. But as I said, the other 35% can go on to have seizures all the time. And at the really hard end, we're talking about what we call intractable or medication-resistant epilepsy. And there are certainly people that have seizures on a daily basis. At the really tough end, hundreds of seizures in a day, every day. So it can be very, very devastating for many. Next slide, please. So a quick word about Epilepsy Action Australia. We do support people right across the country that are living with any one of the 35 or so different forms of epilepsy and seizure syndromes. We deliver information online, on phone, websites, personal training in the community. We're involved in research. So a whole range of different activities. Next slide, please. Where did this all begin for us? Well, it began back in 2013 when we first heard that cannabis might be a treatment option. Some of you heard of the medication Charlotte's Web? Okay, so it was named after this little girl, Charlotte Figge. She has Dravet syndrome, one of the devastating forms of epilepsy. And children with Dravet syndrome sometimes don't live to their teenage years. They're having ongoing uncontrolled seizures and cognitive and developmental problems as a result of Dravet syndrome as well. And this family gave Charlotte a designer strain of cannabis in illicit form at the time of cannabis. Charlotte is still doing well today, is the short part of that story. Next slide, please. So what's the reality in Australia today, given there's been so much attention given to medical cannabis and the government legalised, inverted commas, medical cannabis some years ago now, in 2016, but what is the situation today? Well, the majority of people are still actually accessing cannabis for medical purposes in one of these ways. They're either doing a mail order, so they're actually going onto the site of a company overseas, typically Canada, US, but other countries as well. They're putting in a mail order and it's mostly arriving in the mail. A package arrives in the mail. There have been stories of, some of it being seized at airports and, in the post and so on, but mostly it arrives and that's still happening. Of course, people do travel overseas, and I'll tell you about a story in a moment, but lots of trips backwards and forwards to Canada and the United States, sourcing products from there and bringing it in for the 3 months that you're allowed to bring it in for. Of course, there's the black market, which I prefer to call the green market, and lots of people will talk to you about that here. There are a number of compassionate suppliers and others who are supplying product. And of course there's, and Dr. Deb spoke about this, there are a lot of people that have actually learnt how to make their own oils and tinctures, and they're growing it themselves. So that's still the way that most cannabis is accessed today in Australia. Next slide, please. In terms of the population, there have been lots of surveys done, and there is 90% or greater agreement that medical cannabis should be readily available to all. But, the reality is that through a doctor at the moment, it's still a lot more difficult to get hold of it in that way. Next slide. Look, yesterday I talked about these patients, their particular patients who I credit with being my educator and the educator of my nursing staff. And I just want to briefly sort of tell these stories again, even though I'm repeating. I think it's really important to see why we changed our attitudes. Little Jai, you can see in 2012 there, is probably the best medically documented case of paediatric epilepsy I've ever seen. He was treated for a number of years in conventional ways. He has multiple epilepsy syndromes and seizure types. He was being measured through EEG at having 500 seizures per day, every day. He was on 35 tablets per day in 2012. And that was anti-epileptic medications, benzodiazepine, steroids and a variety of things in an attempt to stop the seizures. CPR was needed by all the family. It was a regular occurrence for Jai to need to be resuscitated and a very regular occurrence for Jai to have to be taken to the hospital by ambulance. He was not able to walk, he was non-verbal, he was drooling. Very sick little boy, couldn't control his own bodily functions, temperature, bowels and so on. His IQ couldn't be measured, and no doubt a mix of the epilepsy syndromes and the plethora of medications that he was taking. Mum is a great advocate. Dad works in the Defence Force in Queensland. So you can imagine taking an illicit cannabis was not high on their minds, or giving Jai an illicit cannabis. But, this little boy was so sick that one day Dad came home and just said, do what you need to do. And they did try an illicit cannabis product. Within hours, Jai's seizures actually slowed, and within days you couldn't see the clinical seizures. In other words, the ones that you see that are tonic-clonic, if someone falls to the ground, they convulse. They stopped. They actually stopped. And Jai went for 2.5 years not having a clinical seizure that you could observe. He may have still been having some subclinical seizures measured through EEG, but his quality of life changed enormously. You can see 2016, a much happier, healthy boy that went to school for the first time, and he could only go for half a day, but the main reason he could only go for half a day was he needed to have his dose of cannabis, and the school wouldn't give it to him, of course, so he had to come home and have his dose of cannabis. Things did take a turn for the worst. We don't know quite what happened, but 2.5 years later he did become quite sick, and he had to go back to hospital, and the hospital said, well, you take him off that cannabis if we're to treat him here. And it then took us another couple of years to lobby the government, meetings with all kinds of people in Queensland government, and eventually he was prescribed a legal product. He is now doing quite well. You can see 2019 pictures there. He's at school. He's doing well. He has some deficits caused by the syndromes and long-term medication, but overall he's doing reasonably well, and he's on monotherapy, which means the only medicine he is taking is a cannabis oil. Next slide, please. This young man was, I think, about 18 when we met him, and he's now 21. And Lindsay actually has a brain tumour. It's not a malignant brain tumour, but it is one that's hard to operate on, so he lives with that, and the brain tumour causes the epilepsy that he has. This family has had to travel to and from the United States and Canada 5 times that I'm aware of, and the last time they actually fundraised in the community to get enough money to do it. I think short of selling their home now, there's probably not much opportunity to go back. But Dr. Deb was talking about what I would call precision medicine before, individualised medicine. And I think it will be a happy day for humanity when, all medicines can be individualised for a patient. In Lindsay's case, there are particular cannabis medicines that he needs, particular strains and particular dosages, and it's not readily available in Australia. In fact, one of the medicines he was getting in Australia recently through the doctor and through the hospital, actually the supply was interrupted, and that's a problem for a lot of people now who are getting their cannabis finally via their doctors. The supply is not guaranteed. So a lot of the cannabis medicines that we're getting here that are being prescribed are from overseas, the majority by far. And things go wrong, and then, there's no medicine suddenly. Now, that is really, really dangerous for a person, particularly a child with epilepsy. You never stop an anti-epileptic medication suddenly. It's really, really dangerous. But what do you do when the supply dries up? Anyway, Lindsay and his mum, backwards and forwards, bringing back the few months of medication they could bring. The next slide's actually just going to show you, it's not super clear, but it will show you what happens for Lindsay. Over here in image 1, you see the white area, that's a brain scan. The white area is the tumour and the edema at the time Lindsay was diagnosed. When he went overseas and actually in 2014 and got cannabinoid treatment in the US, you can see that it shrunk considerably. And this is what happens. His tumour shrinks, his seizures stop when he gets the right medicine. Of course, the medicine ran out, and you can see it starting to show up again, getting bigger, and the seizures stop, gets back on cannabis medicine, and it reduces again after a month's a month's treatment, sorry.
Sorry, 2 seconds. Someone's got a car with disability with their window down. 13DLM, just passing on the news. Okay.
It's a goldish window, and it's 13DLM.
Someone with a gold Hyundai. Okay, next slide, thanks. This is little Michaela. This video didn't play very well for us yesterday, so we'll just see how it goes, and we might just stop it earlier, but you can hear Michaela's mum talking.
This was 13-year-old Michaela's reality just last month.
So she will vocalise, she'll scream a lot. She tries to relieve the pain in her head by banging her head on the headrest of her wheelchair or anything that's within reach.
Born with a severe and rare neurological condition, Michaela suffers up to 100 seizures a day, some so bad they put her in hospital.
In the early years, we were admitted probably every 2 to 3 months in what was called a seizure crisis, where her seizures would escalate to a point and the medications that I used at home no longer had any impact.
What has made a difference is medicinal cannabis. After a lengthy approval process, Michaela was granted a prescription, one of only 33 Western Australian patients. The CBD oil doesn't contain THC, which is the psychoactive compound in the plant.
Her whole demeanour has completely changed. She's gone from being stressed, anxious, uncomfortable, miserable, don't touch me, to being calm and relaxed.
But the high dose required doesn't come cheap. Her family now faces losing their home to pay for the drug.
Each bottle has 25 mils in it, and that is a 6.5 day supply for Michaela, and each bottle costs $533.
With
Cost. one of the other factors, and I'll speak a little bit more about that, but you know, people are now actually getting prescriptions. They weren't for a while there, but now there are some prescriptions being written, but what we don't know is how many people never fill their prescriptions because they can't afford it. There are a range of barriers that still exist. We still think that medical practitioners are needing education. And I asked yesterday how many people have actually attempted to talk to their doctor. I think things are improving, but what we're hearing is there's still a large number of doctors that are not educated themselves in cannabinoid medicines. You know, it wasn't in the curricula when they did their training, and there's still not enough out there to educate them now, so they're not comfortable, or they still have attitudes that are more steeped in, you know, the concern about the harm that cannabis can do rather than understanding the good that it can do. So that remains a barrier. And, you know, there is more research needed. We'd be the last people to sort of talk about not needing research, that it should be just available. But research takes time and it takes money, and, we'd like to see things fast-tracked much more. There's some interesting research going on at the University of Sydney. Have any of you heard of the Lambert Initiative? No, so really briefly, I talked about little Charlotte that has Dravet syndrome. There's another little girl there's lots of little girls, but one little girl in Australia who is Caitlin Lambert is her name, and she was only about a 5 or 6 year old, I think, when I first met her. Again, Dravet syndrome, very, very devastating sort of situation. And her family too gave her an illicit form of cannabis, and it was the only thing that really helped. They'd been through all sorts of things. Now, as fortune has it, her grandfather, a man called Barry Lambert, had actually made quite a lot of money by selling his business to the University of Sydney, to the point where, let me just rearrange that, selling his business to Commonwealth Bank. He actually donated to the University of Sydney $33.7 million to set up a research facility for cannabinoid-based medicine. That research is amazing, but of course it started at the very basics. You know, when medicines are produced, we're often not hearing about them for years. You know, they're in Petri dishes and test tubes. It's back at that stage, what we call preclinical. It's a long while before we hear about clinical trials. And in this case with cannabis, of course, there's a community expectation that it be made available now. So they're back starting at scratch. But there is some really exciting stuff there. I mean, the thing that's known to be anticonvulsant with epilepsy is cannabidiol, CBD, which you've heard about. You heard Dr. Deb talk about it. But it's quite exciting. There's at least 3 or 4 other cannabinoids that might be better anticonvulsants than CBD. So, point is, we don't know what we don't know, and all of this is going to take some time. The fact that there's been prohibition for all of these years has also meant that there's been no research, or very little research. We're in catch-up mode, is what's happening. We do believe that there needs to be further education of patients, people who want to use cannabis. Cannabis is not a silver bullet for every condition, for every person, but it is going to work for some. So we actually want to help people have more realistic expectations. We've met some very sick people who've tried to source cannabis for cures. That might not be possible at all. Again, we don't know what we don't know, and it's going to take some time. And look, finally, there are still some problems with access through the various state governments. There's still some differences. Next slide, please, and we'll speak a bit more about that. So the federal government has actually been trying to bring all of the states and territories into alignment, that applying for a cannabis medicine is quite, similar from state to state. And they've had a lot of success, but there are still some areas that are outside of that streamlined process, particularly Tasmania and the ACT. So it was the case that to apply for a cannabis medicine, you actually had to put in applications, or the doctor had to put in applications to both the state government and the federal government. They've actually tried to, what Minister Hunt calls, harmonise that, but it's still not perfect. The other thing I'll just point out on the map that's on the screen, and I apologise, some of the figures are out of date. It says up the top 6,000 prescriptions have been issued in Australia. It's actually more like 20,000 now, with most of those prescriptions having happened in the last 6 to 12 months. So it was very slow from 2016, very, very slow, but increasingly there are more and more prescriptions being given out every month. That's prescriptions, not patients. So in other words, if you've got a prescription, you've probably also had to go back every few months to get a repeat. And the other thing we don't know is how many prescriptions have actually been issued where the family couldn't afford the medication. The estimates for how many people are using green market or illicit cannabis for medical conditions is between 1 and 200,000 people in Australia. That's based on a range of surveys, including those that the University of Sydney do. Okay, next slide, please. I just want to introduce you to a resource that we've created. It's called C4E, or Cannabis for Epilepsy. It's a website. And while it's for epilepsy, cannabis for epilepsy, if you have conditions other than epilepsy, about 80% of the information on here is relevant to you as well. So it is going to explain the endocannabinoid system, it is going to explain phytocannabinoids, or the plants, and then it does go into some detail in epilepsy and cannabis. I mentioned yesterday that we're actually doing some work to broaden that to other conditions, and the main reason we're doing that is whenever we're out in the community talking about cannabis, we're usually the only health condition non-profit that's there. We haven't seen the other organisations out there yet. I think they're probably still waiting for, government to really approve totally, or they're waiting for the research to be conclusive. We're out there, and so we're talking to people with all kinds of conditions, and we're going to broaden our information to cover other conditions as well. Just quickly, we'll run through the slides of what's on this website. It's in very user-friendly form, it's easily accessible, and there's a whole range of information. And, it will sort of cover things from how you access in various states and territories through to understanding, the different barriers. It has patient stories. We'll just skip through quickly here, sister. It's got various sections. It's got an interactive map that shows what's going on in your state or territory. It has ways to participate in research and latest news and life stories. Next slide. And I thought I might just let you see, I've got several videos because my presentation often goes an hour or so, but I thought I'd just let you see the quality and the understandability. So Dr. Deb before talked to you about the endocannabinoid system. Let's just have a look at this video and this is how it will be explained.
Like the circulatory system and the lymphatic system. But only in the last few decades has the endocannabinoid system become a focus of research, broadening our understanding of its role in the body. This is a system that produces and uses endocannabinoids to regulate signalling and communication between the cells in the brain and the body. This is a nerve cell, known as a neuron, and is vital for taking messages between the brain and body. Signalling molecules travel between neighbouring neurons across a gap called a synapse. Endocannabinoids are one type of signalling molecule naturally made in the body. They travel across synapses to communicate information between neurons. They can be found throughout the body, especially in the brain, organs, connective tissues, glands, and immune cells. Anandamide and 2-AG are just two examples of endocannabinoids. To be able to pass messages between neurons, the endocannabinoids need to interact with cannabinoid receptors. These endocannabinoids and cannabinoid receptors perform different tasks, but the goal is always the same: to maintain a stable internal environment known as homeostasis. Two types of cannabinoid receptors are cannabinoid receptor 1 or CB1 and cannabinoid receptor 2 or CB2. CB1 receptors are primarily located on neurons, which are the key signalling cells of the brain and nervous system. They are associated with sleep, appetite, pain perception, and memory. CB2 receptors, although fewer in number, are found throughout the body and are associated with the immune system, where they influence pain, inflammation, and tissue damage. There are also a number of G-protein coupled receptors, which may also be involved in regulating the endocannabinoid system. Our bodies are making endocannabinoids all the time, knowing exactly when and how to make them. However, sometimes the endocannabinoid system may become dysregulated. Fortunately, research is discovering more about phytocannabinoids. These are cannabinoids naturally occurring in plants, which can interact with the human endocannabinoid system. To learn more about phytocannabinoids, view the C4E video, Understanding Cannabis.
So there are a number of videos that explain, as I said, the phytocannabinoids and also go into epilepsy and cannabis. I'm going to skip those today. In fact, I'm going to stop my presentation there and ask Sister if she'll put up just the last slide, which has our contact details on it. Please get in touch. Can I just ask, are there any questions at all that you might want to ask of me before I do conclude today? Yes. So risks, the question is about risks to the patient? Okay, are you wanting me to distinguish between what's known as licit and illicit cannabis? Okay, all right. If you are using unregulated product, you know, and let me tell you, some of the government refer to this quite disrespectfully as brown goo. If you are taking illicit product, you cannot be guaranteed. You cannot be guaranteed of what's in that product, of the quality of that product, because you can access it anywhere. A lot of people will say grow your own because you at least know exactly what has happened. But there is always that risk of contaminants, and also the risk of getting different product each time. There's a real problem with having your product analysed in Australia. There's a couple of research projects where we have been able to get product analysed through the Lambert Initiative at Sydney University, but for the most part you can't. So, you're taking that risk of not being quite certain of what's in it. If you're taking a medicine that's prescribed by a doctor. As you've heard, the first problem is actually getting that prescription in the first place. It's still challenging. And the second thing is actually affording it. At the moment, cannabis in Australia is, it's really strange, it's approved, unapproved medicine. In other words, it hasn't been through what's known as the ARTG. You know, the regulatory processes and the regulations that are needed for most medicines to be prescribed in Australia. The government has approved for certain medicines to be imported, and now very slowly some of the Australian licensed companies are starting to produce product here, but it's still mostly imported product. So it's not on the ARTG, the Register for Therapeutic Goods, at this point in time, but hopefully it's at least what's called GMP, good manufacturing process. So you've got some guarantees in there. Now, I think one of the biggest risks, if people are taking a cannabinoid medicine without anyone overseeing that, a medical person or whatever, there are drug-to-drug interactions that you need to be aware of. To give you an example with children with epilepsy, some children with epilepsy are on multiple anti-epileptic medications. If their parents then introduce a cannabinoid product without being aware of those drug-to-drug interactions, there are risks, and that could include risks to their liver. So it's really important to understand drug-to-drug interactions, to have somebody to talk with about that, rather than just self-medicating, particularly if you're putting that on top of other medications that's being prescribed. Yeah.
Just in relation to that, it brings a really valid point that sometimes you don't have someone to go to us for that prescription. You can have a team of neurologists, epileptologists, and I deal with them all the time, and they just shut you down. Do you know what I mean? So if you've got no one to go to, where do you go?
Yeah.
Who monitors that?
Yeah.
Because they then threaten you, if you don't do as they say, they try to throw you out of the system. You know, it's a really...
It's one of the biggest issues around at the moment, and that's why I talk about still the need for education and acceptance and so on. We all have to keep lobbying. If you're talking to your doctors, keep asking. Don't be put off, keep asking. Look, if you're talking about epilepsy at the moment, please feel free to get in touch with us. We do have clinical nurses, clinical nurse consultants and specialists, and we have done the best we can to educate ourselves, and we'd be happy to try and help. So please do try and get in touch with us. Yes?
Also Dr. T and many other registered medical practitioners will be here to talk today.
So there are a number of clinics now available, and John T is certainly working with one of those clinics. But feel free to get in touch with us.
From Melbourne, and my son's just done 6 months in hospital, and seizures just quadrupled. And he's on more drugs. They've changed his drugs like he's a testimony, and not once when I've begged and pleaded from the medicinal cannabis. Yeah. Oh no, we haven't got a really reliable source. It's just rubbish.
Yeah, there certainly are problems with supply, as I mentioned, with source and with cost. They certainly all exist.
They also pick their test dummies as well. And if you're someone that bucks the system and doesn't sort of accept what they say, you're not going to be that person that gets off at that trial.
Well, do feel free to get in touch. 1300 Epilepsy is our phone number, and ask to speak to me personally or get a message to me, and I'd be happy to get you in touch with some of the nurses. A couple of other questions. Yeah.
I've got a friend in Tasmania, and he got one over when he was 19, now he's 72, he's always worked on that. He's got chronic back pain and it's down with his foot pain. He's currently taking medication, but he said almost nothing stops the pain, so that's why I'm here today. And he lives in Tasmania, so what would be the best source for me to get him the medical marijuana? Would I get it at the embassy or what?
Wow, getting a prescription in Tasmania is really tough if you were wanting to get it through a doctor.
Can I say something?
Yeah, please.
Look, one of our next guest speakers is a registered medical practitioner, so you can get it legally prescribed. You can get your cannabis legally prescribed.
And I
For
think you can
example,
get it
like
from
this.
anywhere, can't you, Dr. John?
Yeah, and so
On a
yeah,
Skype.
just wait and hear him talk. He does later on today.
I think some of the
Yes,
clinics,
in a minute.
some of the clinics are actually using telehealth.
They are legal in this grey market, but legal.
Yeah, once again, Tasmania, obviously.
Yeah, there's good and there's bad in Tasmania. The good is they actually cover the cost. The bad is that hardly anyone's been prescribed.
That's why they cover the cost.
Yeah, that's what I do.
Yeah. Jax, hey.
I just wanted to mention to people that they're desperate to save your life, but the system won't help you anymore. For me, that was my decision to come to New homeless, live on the street, but I can afford my medicine. Now I live a very comfortable life.
This young lady's looking great.
The only answer we have is ourselves. We must take your own power in your own hand and save your own life. Even if it's illegal, just do what you do because we're alive and we want to live.
If you look on the Nimbin Medican website, you'll hear this lovely lady's testimony on stage. She gave an excellent talk.
It's not like you're used to getting your prescription at the doctor. It's a very different way of it works. I would have died if I had not done this. The system is just too big. Just disappear and die. You can take control. It's very uncomfortable and it's different, but we can do it.
So the takeaway, the takeaway message from me, as I said, is do keep lobbying, do keep asking, do take control of your own life. Call us if we can assist in any way. We're very happy to have a nurse speak to one of you and share whatever knowledge that we've gained. And as I said, just a little bit later this year, we'll actually be formally increasing our service to assist people with a range of conditions, not only epilepsy. So please do get in touch. Pleasure to talk to you. I've always met great people when I've come up to the Medican's symposiums, and I hope you learn a lot. You've certainly got some good people. Maybe one more question.
Yeah. In how many cases of epilepsy or any other type of condition people go into remission, full remission of that condition due to cannabis?
Look, I don't have figures readily available. So the question was around remission. And as a result of using cannabis. Some of the clinical trials that have been done now, so I was saying before, research is catching up. There weren't clinical trials for a long time, so we haven't got data. But there are some being done, particularly in paediatric epilepsy now. And with some of those, now this is the credible evidence that the government and the doctors will accept. There was one study done where I think it was something like 42% of the children through the trial had 50% or greater reduction in seizures. A small number of them became seizure-free. So it's not huge numbers. I mean, when you hear about paediatric epilepsy, not every child is assisted, and there seem to be some syndromes, more than others, that are responsive to cannabis. There are definitely the miracle stories. They're definitely there. I've met those kids myself where they've been having, dozens of seizures, as I said, on a daily basis sometimes, and they have become seizure-free. It's not the majority. It's not the majority. It's a small number. A small number actually have got worse on cannabis. So they've had their seizures, they've had cannabis, and it actually seems to have exacerbated. So we just have so much to learn, but certainly there's a significant number that are seeing improvement. It's well worth, pursuing this course as a treatment option. There's no doubt about that. All right, I might stop there because I think I've gone over time. But as I said, it's always great to talk with you, and thank you for your attention, and hope you enjoy the rest of